In this lecture, we are going to cover a lot of history, but not super in depth. I'm going to kind of take you through a whirlwind history of evolutionary thought. I'm also going to point out some things that have probably been omitted from your educational history in the past. I will cover why that is and why it's important that we reinstate it as part of the narrative. So really, people have been thinking about evolution without putting a name to it for quite a long period of time because scholars, what they do, in the last lecture, we talked about knowledge institutions or knowledge systems. And part of developing that is recognizing patterns and then trying to explain them. And people have been recognizing patterns in animals or various organizations for quite a long time and trying to explain those. So the workings of what we know today as evolutionary theory, they have deep historical roots. So we'll cover some of those. We'll cover some of the dead ends, the ways we went wrong, and then the ways that we kind of fixed things as we went along. So first, it's important, I think, to all be on the same page about important definitions. And our first important definition is evolution. Evolution, how we define it today, is not the same way that we defined it in the past, especially at the very beginnings of evolutionary theory's life. And this is because today we are familiar with things that we can't see with the naked eye. And those things that I'm talking about are called alleles. Alleles are versions of genes. 200 years ago, people didn't realize that this is how, genetic information was um, copied, replicated, transmitted from one organism to a fetus, during reproduction. So, evolution today is defined as change in allele frequency over time within a breeding population, meaning that we're looking at the same species. For something to be considered a species, it needs to be able to breed with other individuals that look the same as it does. And evolution can absolutely manifest in physical changes, but it also doesn't have to be visible changes. So things like change in blood type or blood cell shape, skin cells, those are not things that you can really see with your naked eye. So, you can't really quantify that if you're just trying to record things just by pure observation. Now we have technology where we can see those things, so we can quantify it. But there are other things too, like that would be less visible, such as maybe amount of hormones in your body. And so the genes or the alleles, I guess is technically the better term, the allele frequencies, the amount of that allele in the population might be shifting over time, but it may not be immediately apparent, but things will still be changing. But dominant genes mask recessive genes. So even if the recessive frequency is changing, it may not always be immediately visible. So just be aware that evolution is not always super obvious and it appears on different time scales. So we've got over 2,000 years of written history that show us that people are thinking about changes in organisms over time and how to explain those changes. They just hadn't quite got it down to a really reliable explanation until quite a bit later. And to give you a sense of what people might see visually, that they were like, oh, that's something I should ask a question about. There's something going on there. Is on the screen, I've got let's just look at this breeding population of, let's say, 10 mice. In our first generation, and that's not the very, very first generation to ever exist, that's the first generation that we are examining. So generation one here, or generation zero, we've got half of the mice, so five of them have brown fur and half of them have gray fur. Now, by the time we get to generation two, we've got eight mice that have brown fur and two mice that have gray fur. So already from generation one to generation two, we can visually see a difference. By the time we get to generation three, there are no longer any gray mice. They are all light brown fur. Now, you can see that in between each of these generations, there is actually a mechanism being displayed to you that is an explaining thing for what's going on with the fur phenotype. And that has to do with predation. So in this instance, we've got a fox The fox is selectively eating the gray mice. That's probably not because they taste better. It's probably because they were easier to spot. Like imagine that they're living in a desert environment where there's a lot of dirt. The light brown mice are going to be able to hide more easily or blend in more easily with the background, and the gray mice are not going to be able to do that. So they're really easy pickings for the predator. It's harder for them to hide. So foxes want to work smarter, not harder. So they predominantly eat the gray mice just because it saves them time, energy, and effort, which is all great for them. But what we see is that because all of the gray mice are getting eaten, a lot of them are not surviving to reproductive age, so they can't really pass on those genes in high quantities for the gray fur. More and more of these dominant alleles, which code for the light brown fur. So we're getting more and more of those in the population than the recessive gray allele genes. So there is definitely a pressure that is shifting the amount of allele frequencies in this population, and that is evolution. If you can look over multiple generations and see shifts in allele frequencies. And by allele frequency, I mean the number of dominant alleles or the number of recessive alleles in the total population. So each of these individuals has two alleles. You get an allele from mom. So each of these individuals has two alleles. And over time, if you look at the number of capital A's, which are the dominant alleles, in this population over time, the amount of capital A's out of the total 20 alleles, so 2 times 10, so 10 of individuals, each individual has two alleles, 2 times 10 is 20. So the number of capital A's, the dominant allele over time goes up, so that frequency increases. The number of lowercase a's or recessive alleles decrease over time, so that frequency is decreasing. So you can see that through three generations, we've got alleles shifting in frequency. That is how we define evolution. If the allele frequencies are staying the same, like 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, all through three generations, then evolution is not occurring, and that trait is probably not under some selective pressure. So we could go really far back in time, but I'm just going to hit the highlights of the important things that you should know, the really, really big names here and the big concepts. So we're just going to start with Aristotle's Great Chain of Being. And previous humans, so our institutions here in the United States very much there is an idea that constitutionally there should be a separation of church and state, meaning that the things that are taught, especially in higher education, unless you're taking like a religious studies course, they very much adhere to evidence and knowledge that we have obtained via the scientific method. However, in the past, we didn't have this technology. We didn't have quite so rigorous scientific methods. So individuals used religion a lot more to explain the things that they were seeing around them and try to make sense out of them. They were working with what they had, but these ideas were retained for quite a long period of time. So Aristotle's Great Chain of Being, and sometimes it'll be referred to as slightly different terms than that, but generally that's the gist. Basically, it put organisms on the planet Earth here into a hierarchy, and that hierarchy was read between the lines of like biblical text and knowledge, and it tried to arrange all of these organisms on the planet into big, broad categories, and then say which were closest and furthest from God or from supernatural kind of aspects. So animals, for instance, were placed above plants because animals were seen as being more complex and plants were seen as being more simple. So the more complex a thing is, the more likely it is closer to God. Because if God made humans in his image, then the closer you are to being a human, the closer you are to being more godlike. That is the thought process here. So, animals can move around in the world. They can sense the world. They can parse it. You can probably tell that your dogs and cats, or if you have those as pets, are quite smart. So people were quick to pick up on, animals will figure out patterns. They'll figure out to be close to humans. They'll get fed. And another thing that Aristotle weighted was the mode of reproduction. So a lot of animals give birth to live young, and plants obviously don't. So the individuals who give birth to live young instead of, let's say, eggs, those individuals or those organisms were seen as more complex because humans give birth to live babies. We don't lay eggs, although laying eggs would be a lot simpler, honestly. So anything closer to humans went higher up in the chain. That's basically the pattern that I'm telling you. But you can tell that there are some unique things here that give us a sense of what people were thinking at the time. So gold was at the top of all other, minerals. So minerals down here are at the base, and then gold is one tier above them because it is shiny, it is harder to find. So people want it. When there's not a lot of something, price goes up because demand is high, but the amount of product we have available is low. So people want it, they crave it, they want something that makes them stand out and seem prestigious and have higher social status. So gold, because it was so prized, it got a bump up. Um, and you can see here there are people. The categories of people are split up, and you'll see that women aren't noted here, and that's because for a very long time, including today, just to a lesser degree, women and females were treated as the aberrant, as the other, as the non-standard. So men were considered like the normal, and female were like the aberrant from that. And if you don't believe me, look at the amount of studies on men's health versus women's health. I'm going to tell you right now, it is crazily disproportionate. Men have always been treated in the Western world, other places too, but I'm just talking about the Western world right now. Men have always been treated as the standard and the norm, and females as the aberrant to that, as the counterpart to that, the lesser counterpart. Um, Regardless, in this sense, we're talking about the common folk. So that's at the bottom of the human tiers here. Then we've got nobles, then we've got princes, then we've got the church, then we've got the king. Now, these two here, king and church, that was fairly like under contest. It was contested because the church and the king were vying for power. Now the church says, "Hey, we don't take our orders from a king. We get our orders from up top, which means we're listening to the head honcho, God up there. So we really shouldn't be subjected to the king." Now the king is like, if I can't control everybody, then I control nobody, right? Like if people are going to say, "Hey, these people in the church aren't listening to him, I don't want to listen to him either." So there has been a long struggle battle between the political head and the in this case is largely like the Catholic Church, but the head of a church about who had the most political power, who has the most say in what people on earth do. And if you are familiar with the history of King Henry VIII, then you'll know how contemptuous this was. Like King Henry VIII was like, "You don't want to give me my divorces, you don't want to do things the way I want to do. Okay, well then I'm gonna make my own church." And he broke off and made the Church of England. So if you're interested in history, go read about that because it'll really exemplify this issue to you. But the idea back in the day was that people who were more affluent or had higher social status, they were more like God because he must favor them if they're of higher social status. So they must be closer to God. So people tried to use things like biblical text to arrange organisms in a hierarchy to explain, well, that's why it's okay that humans go and eat all these animals because animals are less than, so humans are supposed to eat them. And it's okay that animals eat the plants because plants are less than animals, and so that makes sense. This is kind of like where we get the first food chain ideas from. However, this was also used for bad things, right? Because this down here, this category of man at the base of the human strata here in this is hierarchy. This was oftentimes further split up to talk about males, females, free individuals, and enslaved individuals. And so enslaved individuals would obviously be at the bottom of this hierarchy. And so people could argue, well, this is a divine hierarchy. This comes from God, so it must be right. So it's totally okay that we own other human beings because this divine hierarchy, just like we can eat animals, well, these individuals are still humans. They're not down to the animal territory yet, so we don't eat them, but it's okay to own them because they're the lesser of all the humans. And honestly, in the beginning of these thoughts of like how to categorize people based off their different traits, People argued that different races were different species, meaning that they thought we shouldn't interbreed at all. Um, so yeah, so this, although it appears quite, I don't know, like that it's not a bad thing here. It had some bad consequences if you were not a white, cisgender, heterosexual male. It had some consequences for you. But this is really the early ideas of how do we explain all the diversity on this globe? How do we put it into a nice, neat thing so that people can explain patterns that we see and the behaviors that people exemplify as individuals? Now, I want to be clear that when we think about evolutionary history, we often think of Darwin, or if you're, I don't know how good your science teachers have been, but maybe you also think of Wallace, because Wallace and Darwin had the same ideas, but Darwin didn't publish because of religious things. And Wallace wrote to Darwin and was like, "Hey, I have these ideas and I'd like to know your thoughts on them because I know you've had some thoughts about these things before, but I want to go publish this like text and I want to give, presentations about it." And then Darwin was like, "Oh my gosh, this is the exact same thing I wrote." And he was when rushed to publish, and they ended up giving a joint paper. But anyway, people tend to think of evolutionary theory as being this brainchild of primarily Charles Darwin. It's not the case. We think that because our textbooks here in the Western world, US is part of Western dot and Western world, we sanitize our history books and our science textbooks. You think our science textbooks are good? They're good. They're not great, though. We tend to focus on Western European scholars. That is our canon, meaning the things that we typically disseminate and use to teach students. However, there were a number of Islamic scholars that had ideas that Darwin thought, that Darwin built on, didn't credit them really, but built on far before Darwin. So 1,000 years before Darwin, we've got Islamic scholars thinking about how organisms struggle for existence, that some of them make it, some of them don't, some of them reproduce, some of them don't, that species seem to change over time, that environmental factors probably influence the biology of organisms, and that those individuals that were able to use the environment to their advantage or were able to reproduce successfully and rear those offspring, that they probably passed on some sort of characteristics that lended to that survival. So Islamic scholars were ahead of the game here, but we don't tend to talk about them in high school or before high school, because I know I was learning about Darwin and evolution before high school too. And this is because we tend to put Western scientific method as the pinnacle of research, education, knowledge production. But we, the Western world, have been colonizers, meaning that we take things from other people without their consent. And we do this with knowledge as well. We take their knowledge, we don't credit them, and we use it to further ourselves. Because I don't know if you've ever seen those like TikToks or those videos about people being so aghast when they're like, "Did you know they're teaching Arabic numerals in schools?" And it's because our numeral system is like from the Arabic. It is the Arabic system, and it's just the number system that we use. And people are so taken aback because they're like, "Why are we teaching that in our Christian, in our Christian nation?" It's just numbers, dude. But it's things that we co-opt and we use, and we don't teach people the history of them. So they think that we've come up with all this stuff on our own in the Western world, and that's not the case. So the goal of classes like anthropology are to decanonize Western literature, meaning that we try to acknowledge the things that other people have done who were non-Western, who didn't get the credit. We're trying to make sure they get the credit now as a way of like, like it's a bit of retribution here. It's a bit of paying penance. It's a bit of making sure that credit is given where credit is due, because we took the credit for certain ideas that we didn't deserve. And so we want to decanonize the field because we believe that you can't be the best scholar that you can be without looking at different perspectives and different knowledge systems outside of the Western one. So, anyway, this is a part of that, and you'll see me kind of critique some things. Critique is good. I'm never going to ask you to believe 100% of what I'm saying. Everything I say will always be grounded in scientific evidence and research. I'm not giving you my opinion here. And when I do, it'll be very clear that I say anthropologists believe, meaning that our field has taken a stance on that thing. But I'm not here to disseminate my opinion. I'm here to tell you how anthropologists use and interpret data that is available via the scientific method, and not so much in this class, but in other classes like cultural anth, things that have come about via other knowledge systems that are not our scientific method. All right. However, we are going to spend a hot minute in Europe, in what the Western world, because it is important that you do know some of these names and these big concepts that will come to play in this class. So apologies. I'm going to be showing you some old white dudes for a hot minute here. So our Western European evolutionary thought, which is what our scientific method is built upon, the one that we know and love today, that is where it comes from. And it was first codified. The scientific method was first kind of codified and written down and started to get standardized by Sir Francis Bacon in around, mid 1500s to mid 1600s. And this individual is likely influenced by Islamic scholars, but again, probably didn't give credit. So Bacon is referred to as the founder of empiricism. I did mention empirical data in the last lecture, and this is how we produce knowledge in our particular knowledge system. It's based on observation and attempting to have a objective, replicable explanation for said observations. So empiricism is the idea that all learning and all knowledge derives from experience and observation. Knowledge doesn't come from a vibe, it doesn't come from I believe. It comes from like testing variables, holding some the same, most the same, changing one, write down what that difference was, now create an explanatory framework for that thing. And this started to become very prominent in the 17th and 18th centuries in Western Europe. People started being like, hey, that's a pretty good idea. That's a pretty good notion on how to test my thoughts. And a lot of times people were using it for their beliefs because people wanted their beliefs to be upheld by the scientific method because it gave it power. Because if you're a religious person and you want, more people to believe in your God or what have you, whatever deity or framework you subscribe to, having that scientific weight behind it can help you convert people and have them believe that, your religion stands on kind of the same ground as science does. So this got picked up by the scientific method, got adopted by a lot of different groups, particularly those of high status, to try and prove, and again, that's bad science, but try to prove their beliefs and their standpoint to say, hey, there's scientific rigor behind this. Didn't always work out the way they hoped, though. Another very important development that occurs in the history of evolutionary thought in the Western world is the concept of a species. This is probably something you're largely familiar with today. You've probably heard the term species. I don't know how often you think about what is a species or what qualifies as a species, but John Ray was the first person to provide a biological definition of a species, which is a group of morphologically similar organisms, meaning they look the same, that have a common ancestor. So they look a group of organisms that look similar to one another and have a common ancestor. However, today's definition of a species is that those group of similar looking organisms, that they need to be capable of not only reproducing, but reproducing viable, fertile offspring. And the reason I'm putting an emphasis that might be egregious on the word fertile here is because there are animals that are so similar that they can actually reproduce together, but that offspring is sterile. It cannot go on to reproduce another one of itself. So for instance, a mule, does anyone know what kind of hybrid a mule is? What two animals interbreed? A donkey and a horse. So donkey and a horse are so similar that they are able to produce a hybrid. It's called a hybrid. It's not a mule is not a species, it's a hybrid. They create a hybrid that individual can grow up, but it cannot reproduce more mules. And I don't know if that's going to be the case in the future. Things are always evolving, things are always changing. Maybe those two lineages end up converging and are able to become the same species. But as of now, that is not the case. Another example is a liger. That one's a bit easier. That's a tiger and a lion. They occasionally can have a hybrid, but that liger is not a species. It's a hybrid. It is infertile. It is not capable of reproducing. So when we discovered hybrids exist, that's why we kind of change the definition a bit of what a species is. So today's definition means that there needs to be fertile offspring involved. Moving now to another important name that maybe you've heard of before is Carolus Linnaeus, or Carol von Linn. I don't know if that's how you say that, but we all probably know him as Carolus Linnaeus. And he established what we know as the binomial nomenclature. This is another one where I'm going to pull you back to your Latin roots and prefixes here. So bi meaning two. And think about nomial or nomenclature. It kind of sounds like name, right? So it's like a two naming system. And this is where all species get a name that's consisting of two terms. And it's actually the first term is the genus, which is a little bit of a broader group, is the genus. And then the second word is actually their species. So it's a narrowing in of the genus. So the genus tells us where in the kingdom of Animalia we're located. And it's not just always Animalia. Sometimes we're talking about plants. But for this example, where in the kingdom of Animalia we're existing. So maybe we're in, whatever dolphins are in pinnipeds. I don't know. But we're in mammals, for instance. Where in mammals? The genus should give us a sense of what does that thing generally look like. And then species is going to narrow us in even further to exactly what that thing looks like. So there is also sometimes a third word here after the species that is a subspecies. So for instance, we are Homo sapiens sapiens. That's our three names. So we are Homo, that's the genus. We are sapiens, that is the species. We are also subspecies sapiens, so Homo sapiens sapiens. However, Neanderthals are Homo, same genus, sapiens, same species, Neanderthalensis, different subspecies. So just be aware, because we're gonna when we get to hominins, there will be a third word there. So that does happen. But for now, for binomial nomenclature, we're just talking about the genus name and the species name, that two-word designation that should give us a pretty dang good idea of what that organism looks like, what other features it shares with others in its group. A good example. So these words aren't always going to be different. Like gorillas are gorilla. The genus is gorilla and the species is gorilla. Chimpanzees are pan troglodyte. So genus pan, species troglodyte. So they're very vast, and the only reason I know some of these off the top of my head is because I teach this course so much, and I have students look into primates and stuff, so I've got to read the names a lot. But yeah, so if you see the genus gorilla, it's not a misprint, it's not a mistype. It is, in fact, their binomial nomenclature is gorilla. Moving now to the Comte de Buffon. This is, yes, of course, another white dude. He was a French naturalist, and he was kind of our first Western voice that was timidly saying, I'm just kidding, I don't know if he was timidly saying it, he might have been openly saying it, but he was kind of the first one voicing his idea that species might be able to change over time. And this is crazy talk, because a lot of people at the time believed in a concept called the fixity of species, which was that when God made all the species, that they didn't change after that because God made them perfectly. So why would they need to change? And so it is a bit heretical to make a claim like this in the eyes of the church at this time. And the way that the Comte de Buffon kind of explained why he thought this was he used a technique called comparative anatomy. Do you remember when I talked about comparative methods last lecture? Hopefully you do. So he looked at different species, but that had similar kind of anatomical structures. And he also looked at quite different ones and looked at their anatomical structures and was like, the skeleton still seems kind of similar here. Maybe we all started from an original like four-footed creature and kind of diverged out from there. So looking at the skeletal structures in fossils, for instance, is a really great way to visualize relatedness because animals that are more related to one another that might have a more recent ancestor look a lot more similar to one another than animals that diverged a little bit longer ago and then animals that diverged even longer ago. And so he would start to quantify about how similar or different certain creatures looked based off fossils, and he would compare things that were extinct. And this is also a crazy idea. We'll get to it, I think, in a couple of slides. But these old dug up fossils versus modern creatures, he'd be like, they look the same, but there are clear differences here. What is going on? So this individual, these beginnings that species of ideas that species might have changed over time definitely is going to influence two scholars whose names you might have heard, particularly Lamarck, but Cuvier and Lamarck, who we're going to get to here. So Cuvier was a paleontologist and another comparative anatomist, so another person who looks across skeletal systems and tried to figure out how to explain similarities and differences here. And Cuvier built on this idea from the Comte de Buffon. He was like, you're right. Some of these fossils, they look a lot like what we see today, but they are clearly different. And he's like, I think these creatures went extinct. And this idea wasn't novel. It wasn't the first time it was put out there, but it wasn't a well accepted idea because, as I said, it implies that God made a flawed species for it to go extinct, and God didn't do that. But at the same time, Earth was thought to have been created around 4004 BCE. This is a date that was where literal Bible scholars took the Bible and tried to map out like how long each thing in the Bible took, and then work backward to determine the age of the Earth. And they said it was about 6,000 something years old. And for this amount of change, or for these species to go extinct, and then the subsequent change to happen in the modern species, it would have taken a lot more time than these 6,000 years based on even scientific ideas back in the day. So this wasn't quite a well accepted idea at the time, but it was important for the evolutionary theory that would come later, that species do go extinct. Because if things didn't go extinct, then there would be fewer implications for evolution and natural selection. Okay. So now Cuvier wasn't 100% right. We're getting there. We're working our way towards ideas that have been upheld for a long amount of time. But he saw these strata, right, in the rock, and he saw these layers with fossils, and he's trying to explain them. And his conclusion that he drew was that species were fixed. See, he got such a bad vibe from people being like extinct, like God doesn't make mistakes. And he said, okay, so he walked back a little bit. He's like, okay. Species are fixed. They don't change over time, but maybe sometimes they did go extinct. And the way that he tried to reconcile this idea of extinction with biblical scholars was he said, okay, there is evidence in the Bible of killings, of species being killed, maybe not like explicitly wiped out, but like definitely being killed, dying. So why couldn't we kind of extrapolate from there that the outcome might be extinction? So these ideas that I'm about to describe are called catastrophism. The root there, very similar to catastrophic, right? A really big thing that happened that was destructive. So he explained his idea via catastrophism. He said that, things like these biblical floods swept over the earth periodically. They might have created these layers that I see in the rock and also exterminated certain animals at the time. So it wasn't that God created like a flawed species that it couldn't survive. It's that these other things, these big other things happened that couldn't be controlled, and these animals subsequently died, and they didn't make it out because they couldn't swim or something like that. And that's why I've got a picture on the screen of a little comic where there's two dinosaurs sitting on a rock, and they're like watching the ark go away, and they're like, oh crap, was that today? Did we miss it? We missed it. And that's why there's no dinosaurs here today. So anyway, that's a little bit beside the point, just to bring a little bit of humor into the discussion. So he says, when the biblical water waters receded, land started to become available again, then surviving species would repopulate the areas and and that might explain the patterns that we see in fossils plus the layers. So people were they could buy that. They could believe that these like floods, these giant biblical floods could cause things like the layers in there and for certain animals to go extinct. So this allowed a lot of people who were devoutly religious to begin kind of listening and hearing these ideas about extinction and not immediately wanting to tear their skin off. Now, a lot of the scientific perspective here had an opposing view to catastrophism, especially as we move forward in time, and this is called uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism is the idea that the geological processes that we see on the planet today, things like volcanic eruption, things like erosion, things like haboobs out in the desert, yes, that's a real word and a real thing and a real weather function, that all of those things that we see today were the same things operating in the past, the same exact geological processes from the past. And they happened at the same rate. They didn't happen any faster. Why would the earth speed things up or slow things down? That doesn't make a lot of sense. So the most famous proponent of uniformitarianism is this guy called James Hutton. Did you guess he was a white guy? You're right. So he argued that sediments that were deposited primarily on ocean floors, that those would eventually become the strata that we see out in the world with our own eyes. Like tectonic plate movement could push that stuff up, right? And that's how we get mountains that have these strata in them. So things like volcanic eruption could also lift that strata, and then we get mountains. And then the mountains become eroded by things like rain, wind, rivers, waterfalls. And these are cyclical processes. Like the earth is redistributing a lot of these materials again and again and again. So these are very slow processes that needed a lot of time. Like if I sat you outside and I said, you're going to sit there till a new stratum is the singular, sorry, a new stratum appears on top of the old one, you would die before that happened. So it takes a long, long time for these layers to form. So Hutton says there is no way that the earth is 6,000 years old. It just doesn't make sense with what we're seeing. Like scientifically, the patterns that I'm seeing, it's not possible. And this is where we get old earth theory coming from, that these processes are slow. They take a long time. When we add in evolutionary history and we look at the changes in the skeletal structures and genes of certain species, same thing, takes a lot of time. So earth must be a lot older than we previously thought. Now, so you can see I'm popping around to a lot of different people who did a lot of different things. I've got paleontologists, I've got comparative anatomists, and now I've got a geologist. That's because all these disparate ideas, this is why we love holism in anthropology. All of these different ideas are taking different perspectives, different experiments, different tests, and starting to converge on a unified theory. They're all coming to the same kind of conclusion here. So Charles Lyell is he's not around, sorry, anymore. He was a famous geologist and a super close friend of Darwin. And he was influenced, of course, by the scholars that came before, like Hutton. And he traveled around Europe documenting evidence that he thought bolstered the claims of uniformitarianism. And if there were things that contradicted it, a good scholar would document that too. If there was evidence that supported catastrophism, that should also be documented. We don't pick and choose as scientists, right? We document things even if they don't agree with our personal beliefs. So anyway, he largely found a lot of evidence that supported uniformitarianism. And one of the main things that came out of all of this research he did was a principle that's still used by geologists today and archaeologists, which is the principle of superposition. And this is where we know how formation processes work at this point. We know that old or new sediment gets laid down on top of old sediment. So the further down you dig into the deep earth, the lower you go, the older that stuff is. The stuff that is up here is younger. So each layer gets laid down on top of the previous one. So oldest layers will be at the bottom and the youngest layers will be at the top unless there's some sort of disturbance like an earthquake, plate movement, maybe animals dig through there, maybe a hole was dug, things like that. So there can be disturbance. It's rarely as nice and neat as you want it to be, but this helped us before we had a scientific dating technology like isotope analysis. These ideas helped us to determine whether things were older or younger than other things. So imagine you've got a bunch of fossils in here and you're trying to figure out, you're trying to put together a timeline of how things changed over time. It was so helpful to be like, okay, things down in this bottom layer down here. I'm scared to click on that. Sorry, I don't know. I'm using my little zoom bar here, but the things down here at the bottom, if I find fossils down there, they must have been deposited before the fossils I see up in the top layers. So we can start to create a timeline of how things look and change over time. All right, great. So we start to get an idea, a picture of how things might have changed over time. Now we get to the mechanism part because science is not just about documenting patterns, it's about explaining why those patterns might occur. So Lamarck is about to take his swing at the why. Why and how? Why how? Why how do things change over time in organisms? And he was the first Western scientist to propose a mechanism for this change in species over time. And note that I say Western scientist here. I have to I'm morally obligated and curriculumly obligated to teach you the canon here. Just know there are other scholars, non-Western, also having similar ideas, okay? So he came up with what is in a very lengthy form known as the theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics. That's a mouthful. So most of us just say Lamarkianism, because he's a guy who came up with it. So we all kind of understand, we're on the same page about what it entails. So this is the scientific name here. We call it Lamarkianism. So, this theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics is the idea that animals adapted to their environments through the use and disuse of their characteristics, and they could actually change the characteristics they had in their bodies during their lifetime, and those characteristics could be passed on to offspring. So, the quintessential Lamarck's thought here has to do he uses like giraffes, and that's just been kind of the model that was picked up and used to explain his ideas in wide avenues. So that's kind of why I mean it's canon. The giraffe of Lamarck is canon here. So he said, all right, giraffes probably had a short-necked ancestor. That giraffe, all those little neck giraffes, they ate all the leaves that were very easily reachable. So they started to stretch their necks to reach the next higher leaves. Now, then their offspring inherited that little bit longer neck, but now the new generation of giraffes, now all those middle range leaves are eaten. Now they're trying to stretch their necks even more to get the next highest range, and then they're going to pass on that little bit longer neck to the next offspring. Then the next offspring is going to stretch their neck even further. Do you see where I'm going with this? So he said that traits that an individual acquired during their lifetime could be passed on to their offspring. So Lamarck's theory seemed pretty good, and not really theory, hypothesis, let's say. But Lamarck's ideas seemed pretty plausible. Explain change over time. Okay, great. But you know what? It's testable. For this to be a good hypothesis, it's got to be testable. It is. So, there was a study of mice. This is kind of the big thing that disproved Lamarckianism in its form, in its original form. I say that because we're going to come back to Lamarck, and he was kind of right in some ways, but not in the ways you think. So, anyway, so there were some horrible animal experiments, and basically they cut off these tails of mice, and then they made them interbreed, and then they expected the offspring to have a cut off tail too. Because if offspring inherit characteristics that you develop during your lifetime, cutting off their tails, amputating their tails should be passed along. Do you think that happened? If you dye your hair, are your offspring going to have your dyed hair color? No. So this didn't work, and so Lamarckianism kind of became bunk here because it was just very easily refutable. However, Lamarck was closer than he thought, and he probably wouldn't know, unless he's still floating around the ether somewhere. But and he never would have known in his lifetime because we didn't figure out that there's this thing called epigenetics where there are changes that your body can make that don't directly affect your DNA or genetic code. It just kind of like turns on, turns off genes that you have in your DNA already, but maybe weren't already being used or need to stop being used that cause changes in your current biology that can in fact be passed down to offspring without actually changing anything in the genetic code. But Lamarck didn't know anything about that, so he accidentally was kind of right in a way. But there was also something else he was kind of right about, and that was that giraffes that had very long necks did happen to survive better. They were able to reach more leaves, have more offspring, rear those offspring, etc., etc. So they got longer necks probably due to a mutation, which allows for genetic variation to occur. So there probably was a couple weirdo giraffes with longer necks. They interbred, their offspring survived very well, and that got passed along. So Lamarck just didn't understand that giraffes were born with that trait. They didn't like acquire it during their process. They got the long neck trait from their parents who it developed via a mutation, not just because they were stretching their necks. So, Western evolutionary thought, again, I told you it's about explaining patterns and trying to get the how why part, the how dash why component of this. So, another person who contributed to our current knowledge of evolutionary theory and natural selection and things like that was this guy named Thomas Malthus. And despite who we've been talking about a lot of these individuals that look at geological processes and non-human animals, well, Malthus was really interested in humans. So we're now starting to bring the animal models towards the human models, which will get us to the ultimate evolutionary synthesis here. So Malthus lived in England during the Industrial Revolution. If you guessed white dude, you'd be right. And during the Industrial Revolution, health was not super awesome for people. Cities were now full of disease that was passed around really quickly because people were living really close to one another. They didn't have good hygienic practices. In fact, germ theory wouldn't be understood until much later. There were really poor working conditions, really long hours, a lot of pollutants, super high birth rates because people didn't have access to reliable birth control like we do today. And so, because there were all of these, we were basically overpopulating and overextending cities. And so, he noticed starvation was rampant. And he was like, I don't understand, like, why would people be living in an environment that they can't survive in, or why would the environment not be able to allow all these people to survive? So he's asking questions about like, why are there so many people starving here? And what the concept he came up with to explain the patterns he was seeing is something called carrying capacity. And this is the amount of organisms that a particular environment can reliably support. So things like amount of fresh water, amount of consumable vegetables, amount of arable land, amount of available land for number of people. So every environment has its own particular carrying capacity, is what Malthus was saying. And he's saying the problem is that when population of anything, a species could be humans, non-human, whatever, when a population of whatever overshoots that actual carrying capacity of the environment. So let me see if I can do this here. So over here, we've got overshoot over what the environment can support. Not, and I don't even mean just like in a sustainable way necessarily. I just mean in general, the resources available to the people and organisms that live there. What happens is that people start to die, and this is kind of like nature's way of bringing that population down below carrying capacity. And that Malthus is saying this like overshoot and then brought down and then overshoot and then population decrease and then overshoot and then population decrease probably is going to happen over time as it's kind of like the natural world's way of keeping things in balance. And these things will probably get closer and closer over time until ideally the sustainable way to live is to live right below carrying capacity but never exceed it. But that's hard for humans. We reproduce at such a quick rate. So he's giving us this idea of an environment can only sustain so many organisms, even of different types, at a particular time. Cool. All right, so we are getting real close to getting to the theory of evolution here. So the idea of genetic inheritance during Darwin's time is not our idea of genetic inheritance today. The idea of genetic inheritance in Darwin's time was something called blending inheritance. Blending inheritance is an idea that actually probably made a lot of sense at the time because people didn't know about genes and they didn't know about alleles and they didn't know about DNA. So the idea was that people understood that kids look like their parents, right? They're noticing these patterns and they're trying to explain that by saying that, okay, how this works is that offspring are a even mix of mom and dad. So just to use color terms here, like pretend you're an artist and you've got a palette and you're mixing colors to explain this. If mom was the primary color red and dad was the primary color blue, offspring should be purple, like an even blend of those two things. However, the problem is that if you think in more than one generation, this becomes very hard to get behind. So it like I've got a one, two, three, four. Oh, hang on. One, two, three, four. I got four generations here of a tree, of a pedigree chart, basically on a genetic tree here on the screen. And what you'll notice is that if we start with individuals that are, let's just say mom's the color white and dad's the color red, and they reproduce, and we look at four generations of people, that by generation four, everybody should be light pink, meaning there's not a lot of genetic diversity. People all look very similar. Is that what we see? Is that what we see? I don't know if you guys are too young to know the Timmy Turner, What Fairly Odd Parents, there's an episode where he wants to be like everybody else, so everybody's just like gray blobs. That's what it would be like. And that is not good for evolution because it means that we're all susceptible to like similar things. So if one disease came in, like a novel parasite or virus or something came in and infected some of us and we're living in high density cities and we all have similar genetic information, we are gonna probably be wiped out very, very close to extinction. So this probably did make sense before we knew about genes and alleles, but today it cannot be the case, or we would be. Genetic diversity is key to the longevity of a species. And even though we're very similar to one another, we still have a degree of genetic diversity in our species. So we don't all look the same. This is not how inheritance works. And we will go over, I think, starting next week, like what that inheritance actually looks like a little bit this week, too. All right, finally, I've set the stage. This is how in Darwin's time we think about inheritance. Let's enter Charles Darwin, finally, right? Now, Darwin built on the work of a lot of individuals that came before him, and he synthesized a lot of their ideas together. And that work is not to be, I'm not saying that is not hard work. I'm saying that like a lot of the scholars before him used that knowledge that was generated by Islamic scholars, but didn't credit it. So I'm saying that it is important to remember he built on the work of other people, not just Western individuals. Now, Darwin was everyone noted he was pretty curious from a very young age. He graduated from Cambridge. He's like, what should I do? What's going to keep me busy? What's going to keep me entertained? Well, he thought, what'd be a cool gig was to be a gentleman naturalist. That's not really a thing that exists anymore, but basically it's a very affluent, high status individual who is assigned to scholar as their job. A lot of times they could be historians too, or like paleontologists, comparative anatomist, but basically an affluent person. And he wanted to work for the British Royal Navy, and he got a position on the HMS Beagle, which keep that one in the mind because that is always, that is regularly like a Jeopardy question. At the time that he got this gig to be the gentleman naturalist on the HMS Beagle, he was only 22, and much to his chagrin, he was actually third choice for this position. First two people they said, nah, pass. And so Darwin ended up getting it. Now, unfortunately for Darwin, he suffered from extreme seasickness. So for about he was, employed with the ship for about 5 years. But for this 5-year journey, he only spent about 1.5 years actually on board the ship. And he would get just so violently ill. So he would get off the ship at any port he possibly could, spend as much time on land without having, he'd be like, till the last minute, I don't want to go back on this boat. And so he spent a lot of time looking at plants and animals, noticing patterns and trying to explain those observations. So, for instance, on the coast of Argentina, he saw species that were new to him, like armadillos. He'd never seen them before. And he's like, but they kind of look like these other things. Like, how do I explain things like that? But he also found fossils of extinct versions of armadillos, and these were in the same region. And he was like, okay, this is kind of weird to be finding both extinct and extant members, extant meaning still currently living, members of the same kinds of species in the same location. Because if catastrophism happened, wouldn't that whole species have been wiped out? Like if a biblical flood happened and all these armadillos died, would they not have all died? Like he's like trying to reconcile this with the thoughts of Cuvier that came before, and he's just not basically he's just not quite buying it. He's like saying it's not making full sense to me yet. Like something's giving me I'm sus about it. I'm suspicious. However, a lot of Darwin's best observations came from his finches. You'll oftentimes hear them referred to as Darwin's finches. They're the finches of the Galapagos Islands. And they're quite diverse, these finches. And he noticed a lot of things relating to these finches. He noticed that degree of variation, how different two species were from one another, correlated to how far they lived apart from one another. So species that lived closer to each other on the Galapagos Islands tended to look a lot more similar than species that lived further apart on the Galapagos Islands. In fact, they could look so different that they might be mistaken for completely different, completely distinct groups, like even genuses. So his Galapagos finches, he argued, had a lot of adaptations to their particular diet, which is a reflection of their environment. So look at all of these beaks. We've got a bunch of beaks, finch beaks on the screen. And these finches that eat mainly insects, they tend to have smaller beaks. These finches that eat seeds, it depends on the size of the seed, right? So this guy is a large ground finch. He has a huge beak, but he also eats big seeds. Finches that are small, that eat small seeds, have smaller beaks. He noticed that individuals that ate cactus seeds in parts, that those had different beaks. So he was like, these beaks, they make sense for what they're eating. So he knew that his findings were not really aligning with the theological explanations for species and change over time and stuff at the time. And so he stuck to safer stuff, like publishing stuff about fossils and geology in the beginning, because he knew that his theory of evolution, which is not fully put together yet, but that he knew it would be poorly received, especially because he was a newer scholar. He didn't have a lot of publications and clout behind his name quite yet. So after returning home, it took Darwin about 20 years of observation and data collection before he was ready to even present his theory. But like I said, he wasn't the only one working on this idea. And this other guy, Alfred Russel Wallace, sent Darwin his paper in 1858, putting forth these basically the same ideas that Darwin had. And he asked, like, good buddy Darwin, is this like, can I put this out? Like, are people going to believe this? Is this written well? Is this good science? And Darwin's like, oh, shoot, darn, I've got the same ideas. What if we give a joint paper at this society? So they gave a joint paper, and then Darwin published on the Origin of Species, which is his like seminal work, 15 months later. And unfortunately, Darwin's name is the one most attached to this, but I don't think he would have published if it wasn't for Wallace. So really, we should be throwing Wallace's name in there as well. And Wallace came to the same conclusions that Darwin did. So remember that I said that how we define evolution today is not the same as how we defined evolution in the past. So Darwin, prior to knowing about genes, alleles, he defined evolution as descent with modification. So multiple generations, but there's differences in each generation. So species share a common ancestor, but over time they tend to change, and eventually they can change so much that they become two different species. So descent with modification means the offspring of two parents look different from the parents themselves and from each other, that there are differences in each offspring compared to the parents. So they are thus descended with little slight differences and modifications. The variations he's saying are pretty random, and that's actually quite accurate. And they may or may not be present in the following generation. So something doesn't work, doesn't necessarily have to be passed on to the next generation. So here on the screen, I've got a picture of the current, what we know as modern horses, and the horse ancestor, which was a lot tinier in the past. And you can see the change between we've got millions of years of change going on here to give us to the horse species that we know today. So Darwin wasn't really sure about why some difference perpetuated and others didn't, but he wanted to know. So he looked up some dog breeders or breeders of any animals really, but a lot of dog breeders to get answers. And dog breeders use what is called artificial selection, which is that they identify traits that are desirable to them in their particular species. People used to breed carrier pigeons for particular traits back in the day, or racing pigeons. People have been breeding dogs for particular traits for many generations. And so the breeders select those traits. They breed those individuals that have those traits and hope to increase the likelihood that the offspring will have those traits. And this can be to enhance certain things or to just have a particular look, be better at hunting, things like that. But I do want to emphasize that this is genetic modification. Humans are genetically modifying these organisms. Artificial selection is genetic modification, meaning that dogs are GMOs and some of the earliest GMOs, genetically modified organisms. So when people say that GMOs are too recent, that we haven't really experimented with them that much to know the consequences of this, we have been modifying organisms as long as we have been able to recognize that we could get desirable traits from things without even knowing what other traits come with that thing. That's why so many dogs that are purebred have issues like breathing issues or hip issues, because when you breed for a particular trait, you get no control over what other traits come with it. And so you can have a bad trait that's like right next to that other trait that you want on the DNA. And so it happens to come with it a lot, and it will cause issues in the long term. So Darwin noticed that humans would only breed the plants and animals with the traits that they liked, and he noticed that they would get distinctly different over time. So humans and animals, things like fruit flies and pea plants, they reproduce quite quickly. So you can see the big changes over a smaller amount of time than if you were trying to look for changes in humans. So Darwin said, okay, great. Let me think about this process in the natural world as opposed to in this like breeder context. And he thought that nature could act upon the variations in the different individuals. So things like cold, if a dog didn't have enough fur and it lived in a cold environment, it wouldn't survive. So that would pressure them to develop thicker fur. So cold, predation, disease, climate change, etc., that all of those things influence which offspring survive to be able to reproduce. And from these ideas, he came up with the concept of fitness. So Darwinian fitness is not about muscles. It's not about strength. It's not necessarily, it could be a part of it, but it's not really definitionally about that. And it's not about lifespan. A lot of my students tend to think, the longer an individual lives, the more kids they have and that more offspring they had. And that can be true, but it's not always true. Somebody could live to 25 and have 6 kids, and another person could be infertile and live to 75 and have 0 kids. So it's not just about lifespan or strength or agility. It can be about all those things, but it's not. The definition of Darwinian fitness is the relative reproductive success of an individual or a particular, genotype in an environment. So an individual has more fitness if they can survive and reproduce to raise those offspring to reproduce. So in the image at the bottom of the screen, I've got beetles with lower fitness who by generation 3 only have 4 individuals now. And then we've got these brown beetles with higher fitness who by generation 4 have 16 offspring. So they have raised more adult beetles to be of offspring, much like they're able to reproduce. They have reached sexual maturity. And the other picture on the screen shows natural selection. So it's kind of showing the process of predation, where just like the fox example earlier, a bird is finding it easier in this case to notice the light brown mice on this gray field. So they go for the easier one to spot. They eat all the brown mice, and the population of mice over time becomes more heavily dominated by gray fur. So that is the process of natural selection. The selective pressure here is predation by the bird from the sky. So nature selects for traits that are beneficial in a particular environment. Natural selection doesn't have a brain. Like I said, it can't think down the line of how this environment is going to change. So it selects for traits that are good for the environment that exists at a particular time. So premature death selects against disadvantaged traits. If you die early and you can't reproduce, then your traits don't get passed on. So if there are traits that cause a lot of individuals to die off in a particular environment, that decreases the frequency of those traits in subsequent generations. So over many generations, populations of species become more adapted for or more fit to, so higher fitness in a particular environment. This is the process of natural selection. So we will talk about this example when we get there we'll cover natural selection more in depth, but keep this idea of peppered moss in the back of your head, because this is probably the most widely taught example of natural selection in any evolution class that teaches evolution anywhere. Well, maybe just here in the United States, but pretty much universal across the United States. So what was Darwin missing? I told you he doesn't know about genes, he doesn't know about DNA, he doesn't know about the genetic information. So this knowledge wouldn't come until later, starting with this guy called Arthur Weismann, and he published a work called The Germ-Plasm, a Theory of Heredity. So he's trying to figure out how, in fact, genetic material gets from point A, the parents, to point B. And he is the guy who did the mouse tail experiments that I talked about earlier. So if you want to be mad at somebody, be mad at him for cutting off mice tails. Although it was helpful for us to understand that Lamarkianism doesn't work like that. So he came up with a germ-plasm idea, and he said, and this is basically a precursor to DNA. It will eventually become what we know as gametes, but he said that germ-plasm is basically a substance in the body, in germ cells, which are like body cells. Let's just call them cells, okay? He said there's a substance in cells that carried hereditary information. Later, we're going to call these cells gametes. There'll be a special kind of cell called sex cells, but he doesn't really understand the difference of that quite yet. So basically, he is getting us the idea of DNA, but he's calling it germplasm. Now, Weismann, pronounced like a V, predicted that offspring are going to get about half of its germplasm, or like this nebulous genetic information, from one parent and half from the other parent. Makes sense, right? So it's kind of like blending theory so far. But he claimed that the other cells, things that we call somatic cells, those are body cells. Soma means body. And he says these other cells that are part of our body, they don't transmit genetic information during reproduction. This eliminated the possibility for acquired traits to be passed on. So he said the reason the mice tails, that when we amputate them, that the offspring didn't inherit that amputated tail, was because those cells, the cells in the on the not sexual reproduction part of your body, that they don't transmit their genetic information. They replace the cells that they, like your cheek cells replace your cheek cells. That's their job, but they have nothing to do with passing on genetic information. So this was a big step of understanding for inheritance. He basically, not only did he just debunk Lamarck's ideas, but he also explained why it might be that Lamarck's ideas were wrong in the first place by saying, hey, genetic information is only, carried in the reproductive system. It doesn't exist in the rest of the body cells, the somatic cells. Coming now to Mendel, and we will work with Mendel's ideas a bit more next week. But Gregor Mendel was an Augustinian monk, and he gave a series of lectures that would become super influential to our idea of the link between genetics and evolution. And he's most well known for his series of experiments on pea plants, where he bred different generations of pea plants that had variations in things like seed shape, color, pea pod shape, pea pod color, flower position, stem length, things like that. And then he would document what traits arose in the offspring generation, and he would try to look for patterns to explain why some traits stayed, or why some traits got expressed and why some traits didn't. So the traits that Mendel were studying, the physical manifestations, those are things called phenotypes. So they are detectable. So again, not always visible to the naked eye, but maybe detectable via other ways. But the expression of the genotype. And the genotype is your actual allele combo. Remember, one allele from mom, one allele from dad. That combo that you get from parents, that is your genotype. Now, if one of those alleles is a dominant allele, it is going to get expressed even if that other one is a different letter, is a recessive allele, the dominant allele will be expressed. So the phenotype is the actual thing, the actual characteristic that gets expressed. The genotype is what is the combo of alleles that you have. So to understand for Mendelian traits, which are the simplest kind of traits in biology, you have only two alleles that you're dealing with. And the allele can be dominant, which we represent with a capital letter. It can be recessive, which we represent with a lowercase letter. Now, given those two letters, and the fact that you have two alleles, that's your combo, there are only three possible combinations here. You can get, and we're going to use the letter B here for an example. So B, big B, so capital B, that is homozygous dominant. Homo, that prefix means what? So if someone, I'm thinking of homogeneous, but that might not be a term that you know, but homo means same. The prefix homo means same. So it means that we have two of the same type of letter. So dominant is telling us those letters are the capital letters. So homozygous dominant means that person's genotype is two capital letters. Then I'm gonna skip the middle one for a second. I'll come back to it. Coming down to this bottom one, we have two lowercase b's, two recessive alleles. That is called homozygous recessive. Homo, again, meaning the same. We've got two of the same letter. And recessive, meaning those two letters are both lowercase. They're both the recessive version of the allele. So homozygous recessive. Now let's imagine I have one big B, one little b. Those two letters are different from one another. We've got one capital, one lowercase letter. That is why we have the prefix hetero here. Hetero means different. Heterosexuality means people who are attracted to somebody of the different sex than they are. So hetero means different, homo means same. So heterozygous means you've got the genotype is two different letters. And we always write the dominant letter, the capital letter first. Just like you would start the sentence with a capital letter, we always write the capital letter first. So even though little b, big B would be accurate here, technically the way that we write it is always with the capital letter first. Okay, so Mendel put kind of the final nail in the coffin of this blending inheritance because he crossed a yellow pea pod plant with a green pea pod plant. And he noticed that offspring of these two plants, one with green pea pods and one with yellow pea pods, this is real hard to say. When you blended them, when they had offspring from those two individuals, the offspring either had yellow pods or green pods. Now, if blending inheritance was real, we would expect the offspring to have yellow-green pods, the blend of the two parents' phenotype, but it didn't. So we know that blending inheritance doesn't work. So Mendel, when he was documenting the patterns of which traits arose and which traits went away, he noticed that some would go away and then appear in a later generation. So they'd be invisible in this generation, and then they would reappear later. And he called those traits recessive. Those traits that went away and came back, recessive. And the traits that seemed to appear a lot, he called those dominant. He also found out that traits tend to be inherited and expressed quite independently from one another. So for instance, the color of the pea pod, whether yellow or green, had no linkage. Had affected none of the probability of whether the actual pea inside the pod was wrinkled or round. So each kind of trait seemed to be inherited separately of any other trait. And this is called the law of independent assortment, saying that alleles are divvied up very randomly and they are not related to one another. Just because you get mom's brown eyes doesn't mean that or mom's, dominant allele for brown eyes doesn't mean you're not going to get dad's allele for blue hair or whatever, or blue hair, blonde hair. However, now we know this isn't entirely true because if you imagine a string of DNA, let's see if I can draw this. So if you imagine a string of DNA, just pretend that's DNA. That's a disappearing line. Oh, I don't want that. Okay, we've got our string of DNA. Pretend there's like genes. There's a gene here, there's a gene here, there's a gene here, and there's a gene here, and there's a gene all the way down here. All right, the closer that two genes are to one another on the DNA, the more likely they will be inherited together just due to proximity, to being close to one another. Now these still could be separated, but because they are so close, odds are they'll get inherited together. But this gene way down on this end, the odds are it'll be inherited completely separate, like no linkage whatsoever to this gene way down here. So that's a little bit of a complicated thing. I just want to be accurate in how I'm explaining the science, but by and large, especially for this class, genes are inherited separately. Alleles are inherited separately of one another. So the concept of genes, sorry, let me clear this. The concept of genes here is defined as a sequence of DNA that codes for particular proteins, and that is what gets expressed. Like the gene codes for proteins that turn your eye brown, that sort of thing. So that is what a gene is. Now, evolution and natural selection in all its glory that we understand it today is a product of what's called the modern synthesis. And this refers to the merging of Mendelian genetic understanding with Darwinian evolution. So Darwin didn't know about Mendel's work because it was after his time. So currently, today, evolution, how we understand it, is a combination, a synthesis of those things, and not just those things. Things like Malthusian competition, that idea of carrying capacity. This idea of mutation, of variation existing in species, all of those things are blended together to create the modern understanding of evolution and natural selection. So it is at this point when we get the modern synthesis in the early 1930s to 1950s. That's when the modern synthesis is occurring. It was a process to try and figure out how all these pieces fit together. This is where we get the modern definition of evolution as change in allele frequencies over time. So genetic mutations are changes in the genetic code. The DNA is our kind of blueprint, right? And mutations are accidents or changes that happen in there, and they are the original source of all variation in living things. There is no variation that occurred that wasn't a product of mutation at some point. It is random. And it's passed on, and only the mutations that occur in gametes get passed on. Remember, if you get a skin cancer mutation, you don't pass that on because it's in your skin cells and it's not in your reproductive cells. You can't pass that on to your kids. So the modern synthesis also comprised and included this difference in timescale view. So microevolution is referring to changes in gene frequencies between different generations of a population, and we're normally looking at just a few generations. But micro meaning small scale. So microevolution is just looking at differences in frequencies in a few generations, kind of like what I showed you in the previous screen here. Macroevolution is zooming out time-wise, looking at long-term changes in a bigger macro, larger level changes that can lead to speciation because the small changes add up over time and eventually make different groups unable to reproduce together at some point, now creating two different species. So speciation happens, just to define it verbally here, happens when individuals from different populations have become so distinct from one another. So it could be it is the same species, but they kind of live in different places. Humans live in different groups across the globes. But if they become reproductively isolated from one another, They're no longer interbreeding for a long, long period of time. And then changes can accumulate in these two different groups. And then if they were to meet up again, they would no longer be able to reproduce with one another. It is at that point that we refer to them as two different species. So humans have been rapidly urbanizing the globe. We've been building buildings, housing complexes, parking lots, things like that. And we have dramatically changed the landscape for many animals. We have changed not only how animals interact with their environments, but also how animals interact with each other and with us within that environment. So humans have been encroaching on animal environments. Climates are changing largely because of human action, but life seems to find a way because we are the selective pressure for many animals. So these lizards in Puerto Rico are one example of this, where we can see rapid fire evolutionary change, where they have developed longer limbs within recent generations. And this is likely due to having to sprint across hot, open spaces like parking lots. So the longer legs help them cover distances quickly so they don't burn their feet. So you might say, how do we know that happened super recently? Well, we can look at the genomes of forest living lizards who have shorter legs, who are now a different species than these urban living lizards, I think. Don't quote me on that, but I think. And we can compare those two genomes and say, how different are they? How many changes, how many differences in that genotype in the strings of DNA are there between this forest living species and these long limbed urban living species? So once we calculate how many mutations separate those two species, we can figure out, scientists now know how to figure out how many mutations arise per generation of a species. So like X number of generations arise every reproductive cycle, so every generation of this species. And we can work backwards. We can say, okay, we know how fast mutations occur in this species. We know how many mutations separate species one from species two, and we can calculate backwards. And so by doing that, we realize that these two lizard groups diverged about 30 to 80 generations ago, meaning that that is well within human like development times. So it strongly suggests a human caused pressure, not a natural pressure, because that's a relatively fast time to see these bigger morphological changes. Excuse me. Now, I'd like to end by covering a few misconceptions about evolution and its mechanism of natural selection, some common misunderstandings. So if you've ever seen this image where it's like a monkey-looking creature, and then it kind of looks like a chimp walking on two legs, and then a chimp kind of upright, and then eventually it becomes like a Neanderthal, and then it becomes like a human. This shows evolution as like a very linear thing, and it suggests some things that are not true. It's a very oversimplified image. First, it suggests that humans evolved from something like chimpanzees, if not chimpanzees. We did not. There are chimpanzees still around today, so we did not evolve from them. Chimpanzees are our closest living relative. We did share an ancestor a long time ago. They are our closest living relative. So our last common ancestor, we diverged from there and went down different evolutionary trajectories. But we did not evolve from chimpanzees. We evolved from a shared ancestor quite a long time ago that was likely an arboreal creature. That was probably several millions years ago now. That's how far diverged we are, but our DNA is super similar, like what, 99.8 or 98.9, something really close like that. Two, it suggests that evolution is intentional, directional, and has an endpoint. That is not how evolution works. Evolution is not trying to make a perfect creature. Evolution's job is to make sure it doesn't have a job. Evolution is just our way of explaining which creatures reproduce well in particular environments and how we use those explanations to make sense of change in the long term, in the long term. So evolution takes place in fits and starts. There are things called living fossils out there that haven't changed in millions of years because what they're doing is working. So evolution, if there's no selective pressure, change doesn't need to occur in that organism, in that species. So evolution is not a straight line. It has dead ends. It can also revert. it can give you a trait and then it could get rid of the trait later and then you might evolve the trait back. It can do that too. So to give you a sense of this, there is an eel-like creature that lived about 375 million years ago. I am not going to try and pronounce that name. I know my limits. But it was originally a fish that evolved to walk on land. So it developed these precursor fins to fingers and toes. And you can see the skeletal evidence of that in fossils. Then climate changed, waters rose, it became more beneficial to live in the water again. So then it went back into the water, and those digits evolved back into fins because there was no need to maintain the separate, like the finger and toe digits now. They're just using them as fins. It's an energetic investment to make these bones you're not using. So the body starts to slowly get rid of them. So they started with fins, they evolved to limb precursors, and then they went back to fins. Evolution is not a line. That's not, it is about a particular moment in time with a particular environment and what works there and what mutations arise. If mutations are not arising, there's nothing to operate on or select for. Now, we also get questions about like where are humans going to go, right? Like humans are evolving. We're not immune from evolution. But where are we going to end up at some point? How can we maybe evolve in response to climate change? And people are often like, gills would be cool, be able to live underwater if all the, everything's going to get covered in water. That'd be cool. Maybe some webbed hands and feet, being able to breathe underwater, maybe through a different way, not through gills. And that all sounds fantastic as someone who has a horrible fear of drowning. I would love to have any and all of those features that would prevent me from doing that. However, natural selection can't create entirely new anatomical structures. All it can do is make slight variations to things that are already present. So we don't have any precursor for a physiological system that can work as a be like kind of the foundation for us breathing water, breathing air underwater. So for this to occur within like what humans look like now is just not possible. It's not possible. We don't have the precursor mechanism for it to breathe, for it to build upon, for us to get this breathing system. So evolution, it makes tiny modifications, sometimes a little bit larger modifications, but also most of the time tiny modifications to structures that already exist. So it takes a very, very, very long time to get big changes. Also, I'd like to note that evolution isn't perfect. Our bodies are not perfect. And in fact, I might end up assigning some chapters from a book called Human Errors. If I don't, you should read it. It's like about glitches in our anatomy that it explains all the ways that we are not perfect, all of the things that don't work in our body, that if there was a design going on here, all these things that would be different. And this has to do with our evolutionary history because your physiology, um, the way you live and survive and reproduce has to just be good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect. So a lot of parts of our body are prone to injury, such as your ACL. You'll see this in a lot of high level sports or athletes. I have an ACL injury too, but when we switched, and I know it sounds fast, but it happened over millions of years. When we changed from being quadrupedal creatures that walked on four legs to being bipedal creatures that habitually walk on two legs, our leg shape changed. We walked from four bent legs, and now we walk on two straight legs. And we couldn't just snap our fingers and get the perfect anatomy for walking upright. We made modifications to a bent leg system that was already in place. So today we rely much more on our bones than our muscles to support our weight. And normally this does great. We're pretty stacked in a line. That makes it not a lot of pressure on our surrounding soft tissue. But sudden changes in that momentum, our bodies were never meant to bear that kind of stress on our ligaments. Maybe back when we were quadrupeds, sure, it was a lot more flexibility and laxity in those bent knees. But now, because we walk largely straight leg and we can lock our knees too, they're not evolved to bear that kind of stress. So we're very prone to injuries. We're prone to lower back injuries because the way we carry our weight is not awesome, is not perfect for the way we locomote. So evolution just needs an organism that is good enough. It doesn't need it to be perfect, so it doesn't look for perfection. Another question I hear a lot is like, are some species more evolved than others? And this is kind of this is not a good way to ask a question because I don't know how you would scientifically answer this. All of the species that are present on this planet today are a result of millennia of natural selection. We all originated from a primordial soup full of cells and random like amino acid precursors and stuff like that. Actually, probably amino acids, so different chemical constituents. And we all today are a product of that. Maybe certain lineages have been around longer than other lineages, but we all have a similar evolutionary start point as far as organisms go. So technically, humans are no more evolved than yeast or fruit flies. We might be complex in certain ways, and yeast and fruit flies are doing their own thing in other ways for their environment and their lifestyle. However, what sets us apart is our particular ability as humans to survive in a wide range of environments. But this isn't a product of more evolution, it is a particular mutations that became beneficial in our lineage. So I mentioned living fossils, such as an example here I'm presenting is the nautilus. So living fossils represent species that have definitely been around longer than humans, and they've changed very little because what they're doing is working for them. So it's really not cool to say that we are more evolved. It's technically incorrect, even though you may appreciate our evolution more than in other animals. Another good question to ask is a species fitness always the same? So to recap, evolutionary fitness is an individual's ability to survive and reproduce, viable offspring who then also survive to reproduce. So evolutionary fitness and reproductive success is highly dependent on what is going on in the environment at a particular time. But the environment can change. If the environment's stable, sure, fitness can be stable. But if an environment is changing, fitness can change too. So in this original generation of beetles, we've got red beetles and stripy, I don't know, brown, yellow beetles. And this bird is like, dang, those red beetles are really easy to see. I'm going to eat those. So generations later, we've got no red beetles left over. They're all the brown, stripy beetles. However, if that bird dies off and that maybe that red the alleles coding for red beetle, I don't know, shell color, exoskeleton color, wing color, I don't know, but maybe if that can start being present again because there isn't a predation aspect anymore. So fitness got really low for the red beetles here, but eventually could start to increase again depending on environmental circumstances. Finally, does natural selection affect all traits? Every trait that you have, does natural selection affect it? No. It only operates on those traits that influence reproductive success. So, for instance, redheads, my mom is one, are predisposed to a number of genetic conditions that definitely affect health. However, most of those genetic conditions that coexist with the genes, the redhead traits, those don't occur until later in life. One example is Parkinson's disease. Redheads are quite prone to Parkinson's, but the average age of diagnosis for Parkinson's is 60. Since this tends to be past childbearing age, like you can't get really, you're normally in menopause at that time and you can't get pregnant, it doesn't affect overall fitness because you've already done your reproducing. So natural selection doesn't need to step in here. You've already passed it along. Good luck to them, right? So natural selection, the primary mechanism here of evolution, can only operate on traits that have an actual impact on fitness. It does not act on every trait that you have. All right, that's where we're going to wrap this week. We will talk about Mendel inheritance and Punnett squares and stuff, I believe, next time.